I woke up staring at a ceiling I didn't recognize, and the first thing I thought was not thank God I'm alive, but this feels wrong, like waking in someone else's house after a dream that went on too long. The lights were too bright. The air smelled sharp and bitter, that hospital smell that sticks to your throat, and my body felt heavy, not just tired heavy, but disconnected, as if my arms and legs were politely waiting for permission to belong to me again. So I tried to move my hand and it shook, not like fear, more like confusion, ha ha ha. Imagine being in your own body and still feeling like a guest. My mouth was dry, my tongue felt too big. And somewhere nearby, a machine was beeping calmly, far too calmly for how strange everything felt. A nurse leaned over me with a smile that was warm but practiced. The kind you give when you don't know how much truth someone can handle yet. And she said something reassuring about the surgery going well, about me being stable, about rest. But her eyes kept flicking away for half a second too long. Awe, and I remember thinking, I used to notice that look on other people's faces, back when I was the one standing beside hospital beds, that pause before the real sentence. The sentence that changes the air in the room. My throat tightened as I tried to speak. My voice came out thin and broken, like it had been folded too many times. I asked how long I'd been out, she answered, and time didn't mean anything. Because it wasn't time that worried me, it was the feeling that something had happened while I wasn't there, something important, something I should have been awake for. I could feel it in my chest, that quiet pressure. Like a door had been closed somewhere and I hadn't heard it shut. She adjusted my blanket, told me to rest. And then, almost as an afterthought, she said my family had been here, and the word family landed oddly, not comforting, not warm. Just heavy like a box you weren't sure you wanted to open. I asked when. She hesitated again, sigh, and that hesitation did more damage than any bad news could have, because when people hesitate, it means they're choosing their words carefully, not to protect you, but to protect themselves from your reaction. She said they'd been here earlier, while I was still unconscious, and my stomach dropped in a slow, sinking way. Because why would they come when I couldn't speak? Why not wait? Why not be here now? I swallowed and asked if everything was okay, and she nodded too quickly, that same trained nod. But then she added that there had been paperwork. Just some paperwork, nothing for me to worry about right now. Ha ha ha, paperwork, that word people use when they don't want to say what the papers are really for. My heart started beating faster, not panic, not yet. More like instinct, the kind you get right before you realize you've left your purse somewhere. I asked what kind of paperwork, and she looked at the door as if hoping someone else would walk in and take over. Then she looked back at me and said a word I hadn't expected, a word that didn't belong in the same sentence as surgery recovery. A word that sounded legal and cold and completely out of place in a room full of machines and soft blankets. She said guardianship, and for a moment my brain refused to accept it. Like when you hear a sentence in a language you almost understand but not quite. I blinked at her, waiting for her to laugh, to correct herself, to say she meant something else, but she didn't. She just stood there, quiet, almost apologetic, and my chest tightened so hard it felt like the stitches inside me were pulling. Guardianship, I repeated slowly, tasting the word, trying to understand how it had found its way into my hospital room. I asked who filed it, even though a part of me already knew the answer, and when she said your family, something inside me went very still, not shattered, not screaming, just still, like when you drop a glass and it doesn't break right away. That pause before the sound, before the mess, before you realize you'll never put it back the way it was. I tried to sit up and failed, my body refused, my head spun, sigh, and I remember thinking, how strange it is to feel so powerless in a place meant to heal you. She explained gently that it had been filed while I was in surgery, while I was unconscious, while my body was open and my voice was gone. And that detail mattered more than anything else, because it told me this wasn't fear, this wasn't concern, this was timing, careful timing, chosen timing. And suddenly memories started lining up in my head like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't wanted to see before. The unanswered calls, the polite distance. The way conversations had shifted over the years from how are you to we should talk about arrangements. Oh, I felt tears burn behind my eyes, but none fell, not yet. I asked what it meant, this guardianship thing. And she explained in simple terms, control over decisions, finances, property, medical choices, and each word felt heavier than the last, like someone placing stones on my chest one by one. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Ha me, unfit me, who paid my bills on time, remembered every appointment, walked into this hospital on my own 2 feet, but my laughter didn't come because nothing about this felt funny anymore, it felt deliberate. It felt quiet and sharp, like betrayal usually does. She said there would be a hearing, that someone from the court had already stopped by, that an evaluation had been done, and I stared at her in disbelief. An evaluation of me. While I was barely awake, while my body was still full of drugs and pain, and I realized then that whatever had been said about me, whatever had been written down, had happened without my voice in the room, without my side of the story. Without my consent, and that realization settled deep, deeper than the surgery, deeper than the fear. It settled into something colder, something clearer. I lay back against the pillow, staring at that unfamiliar ceiling again, and I whispered. Barely audible, not to her but to myself. They did this while I couldn't speak. And in that moment, as the beeping machine continued its calm little rhythm, I understood something that made my breath catch. Something that changed the shape of everything that came after. Because waking up from surgery wasn't the real shock. The real shock was realizing that while I was unconscious, my life had already started moving without me. And by the time I opened my eyes, the story had already been written, and I hadn't even seen the first page, and that was when I knew whatever was coming next, it wasn't just about surviving surgery anymore. It was about surviving what my own family had decided for me when they thought I'd never wake up. The word stayed with me long after the nurse left the room: guardianship, 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 echoing in my head like a door that wouldn't stop slamming, and the more I repeated it, the less it sounded real. Sigh, it felt like one of those words you hear on the news, attached to strangers, to tragic stories you shake your head at and think how awful. Never a word you expect to be whispered beside your hospital bed while your body is still numb and stitched together. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to slow my breathing, trying to understand how a single word could suddenly stretch itself over every part of my life: my hands, my home, my money, my choices. Ha ha ha, I almost laughed again at the absurdity of it. Because how does someone decide you're unfit when you're not even awake to defend yourself? How do they look at a body fresh out of surgery and call that proof of anything except vulnerability? My throat tightened as I replayed the nurse's tone, gentle but careful, as if she knew she was standing at the edge of something dangerous, something that could not be unsaid. I pressed the call button, not because I needed help, but because I needed answers. Someone came in, another nurse this time, older, calmer, the kind who has seen too much to rush, and I asked her plainly what guardianship meant for me right now, and she paused, sighed that same pause again, before explaining that it meant temporary control, at least until a judge decided otherwise. Temporary, she said, as if that word made it smaller, softer, easier to swallow, but temporary loss is still loss. Temporary silence is still silence, and temporary control still means your life is in someone else's hands. I asked if I had agreed to any of this, and she shook her head no, it had been filed on my behalf for my safety. Those words again, for your safety, the words people use when they're about to take something from you. My chest felt tight, not from pain this time, but from the growing understanding that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a hospital error, this was intentional. Someone had planned this, timed it, waited until I was unconscious, unable to object, unable to ask questions, unable to say the one word that might have stopped everything: no. All I asked when the hearing was, and when she said tomorrow, my heart sank in a slow, heavy way. Tomorrow felt impossibly close, like being told you have one night to prepare for a test you didn't know existed. I hadn't even stood up yet, hadn't eaten, hadn't fully woken, and already there was a clock ticking somewhere outside this room, measuring my worth, my competence, my right to my own life. I turned my head slightly and stared out the window. The daylight looked normal, almost mocking in its calmness: cars passing, people walking, the world going on as if nothing had shifted, while inside me everything felt tilted. I thought about my children, about their faces, their voices, the way they spoke to me lately: polite, distant, always in a hurry. And suddenly those small moments rearranged themselves into something uglier: conversations about planning, about making things easier, about the future, said with a softness that now felt rehearsed. Ha ha ha, I remembered brushing those moments off, telling myself not to be dramatic, not to read too much into things, because that's what mothers do. We excuse, we minimize, we protect, even when the danger is quietly circling us. My fingers curled into the blanket, and I felt a sting behind my eyes. The kind that comes when you realize you trusted the wrong people at the wrong time. I asked if I could speak to someone from the court, and the nurse explained gently that it didn't work that way, not yet. The evaluation had already been done. Notes written, impressions formed, and those impressions would speak louder than I could if I wasn't careful. That's when fear finally slipped in. Not loud fear, not panic, but a steady, creeping fear that crawled under your skin and stayed there. Because what if they believed it? What if they believed I was confused just because I was tired? What if my weakness in this bed was mistaken for weakness in my mind? I had spent my whole life proving I could manage on my own, and now, in the one moment I couldn't stand up straight, that history was being ignored, I closed my eyes and tried to gather my thoughts, but my body still felt heavy, my head still foggy, and the unfairness of it all pressed down on me. They had chosen this moment, this exact moment, when I was least able to fight back, and that choice told me more about their intentions than any explanation ever could. I whispered to myself, almost like a prayer, stay awake. Because it suddenly felt dangerous to close my eyes again, dangerous to let time pass without me watching it, as if something else might be taken if I wasn't paying attention. A soft laugh escaped me then, quiet and bitter. Ha ha ha, imagine being afraid to sleep in a hospital, a place meant to protect you, but that was the reality now. I wasn't just recovering from surgery, I was waking up to a life where decisions had already been made in my absence. And as I lay there listening to the steady beep of the monitor, I realized something that made my stomach drop. The surgery wasn't the most vulnerable moment of my life, this was. The moment when I understood that the people I trusted most had moved ahead without me, and tomorrow, unless I found a way to be heard, they would keep moving, and I would be left behind, legally, quietly, permanently, and that thought. That terrifying, slow-burning thought followed me as the room fell silent again, leaving me alone with the truth that I had only just begun to understand. It wasn't the word itself that finally broke through the fog in my head, it was the timing of it, the way it sat there like a stain you can't scrub out once you notice it, because the more I thought about when this guardianship was filed, the more my chest tightened. Sigh, not last month, not after a fall, not after a mistake, but during surgery, during the one stretch of hours when I had no voice, no awareness, no way to interrupt what was being done in my name. And that realization landed slowly, painfully, like your mind refusing to accept what your instincts already know. I stared at my hands resting on the blanket, thin and pale, IV tape clinging to my skin, and I thought. This wasn't concern, this was strategy. And once that thought formed, it refused to leave. Ha ha ha. Funny how the truth doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it just sits down beside you and waits until you're ready to look at it. I replayed the days leading up to the surgery, the conversations that felt off but harmless at the time, the way my children had asked too many questions about paperwork, about passwords, about what I'd want if something happened. Questions I had answered without suspicion because why wouldn't I? They were my family, I trusted them. I trusted them the way you trust the ground beneath your feet, without thinking, and now that ground felt unstable. Like it had shifted while I wasn't looking. The nurse came back to check my vitals, her movements calm and routine, and I asked her quietly if filing something like that during surgery was normal, and she hesitated. Then shook her head just slightly. No, not usually. That pause said everything she wasn't allowed to say out loud. It told me this wasn't standard procedure. This wasn't urgency driven by danger. This was convenience driven by opportunity. They had waited until I was sedated, until I couldn't object, until any confusion on my face could be written down as proof instead of pain, and the unfairness of it made my throat burn. I remembered how hard I'd worked my whole life to be careful, responsible, independent, how I'd taken pride in handling my own affairs so no one would ever have to worry about me. And now that very independence had been rewritten as isolation, as weakness, as something that needed correcting. Ha ha ha. Imagine being punished for managing your life too well. My heart started beating faster, not panic yet. More like anger waking up slowly from a long sleep, because anger needs clarity before it can stand, and clarity was finally arriving. I realized then that if this had truly been about my safety, they would have waited. They would have spoken to me first, they would have looked me in the eyes and said they were worried, but they didn't. They chose silence, they chose secrecy, they chose a moment when I was most exposed. And that choice said more than any courtroom speech ever could. I asked if my children had been informed about my condition, and the nurse nodded. They'd been told everything went well, that I was stable, that I was expected to recover. And that detail settled like a stone in my stomach, because it meant there was no emergency, no crisis that justified rushing to court, nothing except the simple fact that I couldn't stop them at that moment. I turned my head toward the window again, watching clouds drift slowly past, and I thought about how strange it is that the world keeps moving when your own life feels paused, how betrayal doesn't announce itself with drama. It just quietly rearranges your reality while you're not looking. A soft sound escaped my throat, not quite a laugh, not quite a sob, ha ha ha, more like disbelief leaking out. I had always believed that if something ever happened to me, my children would step in to protect me, to speak for me, not over me, and now I understood that they hadn't stepped in, they had stepped ahead. They had taken my silence as permission, and that hurt in a way surgery never could. The nurse adjusted my pillow and asked if I needed anything, and I almost said my life back, but instead I asked for water. Because sometimes you have to choose the smallest request just to keep yourself from falling apart. As I sipped, my hands shaking slightly, I made a decision without fully realizing it yet, a quiet decision. The kind that forms deep inside before your mind catches up. I wasn't going to let this stay quiet. I wasn't going to let this be explained away as concern or misunderstanding, because I could feel it now, clearly, unmistakably. This wasn't about helping me, it was about controlling the outcome before I could interfere, and the more I thought about it, the more pieces fell into place, the sudden interest in my finances, the comments about how complicated things were getting, the subtle suggestions that maybe it was time to make things easier for everyone, phrases that sounded loving until you realized they didn't include me in the everyone. I felt tears finally spill over, warm and slow, sliding into my hairline, not from fear, but from grief. Grief for the trust I'd given so freely, grief for the mother I'd been who believed love would protect her from being used. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and took a deep breath, careful not to strain the stitches. And in that breath, something shifted, something steadied, because even through the pain and exhaustion, one truth stood out sharper than the rest. They had underestimated me. They thought unconscious meant gone. They thought silence meant surrender. But I was awake now, and the timing that had worked so perfectly for them might turn out to be the very thing that exposed what they'd done. And as I lay there listening to the hum of the hospital around me, I understood that the surgery hadn't been the turning point. This realization was the moment I saw clearly that what happened wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a choice, and once you see that, you can't unsee it, and whatever came next, courtrooms, conversations, consequences, it would all grow out of this single, painful understanding that while I was unconscious, someone else tried to take control of my life, and now that I was awake, the fight had only just begun. By the time the woman with the clipboard walked into my room, the room already felt smaller, like the walls had leaned in just a little. Sigh, she didn't introduce herself properly. Just said her name quickly and told me she was here to check a few things, and that casual tone almost made me laugh, ha ha ha, as if checking a few things wasn't about to decide whether I would keep control of my own life. She stood at the foot of the bed instead of beside it, not close enough to feel human, not far enough to pretend neutrality, and I remember noticing how clean her shoes were, how neat her hair was pulled back. How prepared she looked compared to how unprepared I felt. My body was still heavy, my head still cloudy, every movement pulling at stitches I couldn't see but could definitely feel, and yet here she was, pen ready, eyes sharp. Already looking at me like a problem to be solved, not a person recovering from surgery. She asked me to stay awake and answer clearly, and I wanted to tell her that staying awake felt like work right now. That clarity wasn't something you could demand from a body that had been opened and stitched back together just hours earlier. But I nodded, because nodding was easier than arguing, and arguing felt dangerous. The first question came fast. What day is it? And my mind stalled for half a second, not because I didn't know, but because time had melted into something shapeless since I'd gone under. I answered anyway, and she wrote something down. Her pen scratching the paper like it already knew what it wanted to say. She asked where I lived. I gave my address slowly, carefully, making sure each word landed correctly. My voice shaking not from confusion, but from the effort it took to push it out. Every answer felt like walking across thin ice, knowing that even a pause could be twisted into something ugly. She asked who the president was. And I answered again, feeling ridiculous, like my entire life was being reduced to trivia. And she sighed softly, not loudly enough to be rude, just enough to show impatience. That sigh cut deeper than any sharp word could have. Because it told me she didn't come here to understand me. She came here to confirm something she already believed. Then the questions changed, not facts anymore, but feelings. Do you ever feel overwhelmed managing your daily tasks? Do you ever forget important things? Do you ever feel unsafe alone? And I stared at her, because how do you explain a lifetime in a yes or no box? How do you say no without sounding defensive? How do you say yes without handing someone a weapon? I told her I managed fine, that I'd always managed fine, and she smiled at me, that small, tight smile people use when they think you're lying to yourself. And she said many people don't notice their own decline. It's very common, very normal, and there it was, that word again, normal, the most dangerous word in the room, because it made what she was doing sound reasonable, kind even. While quietly erasing my voice, she asked about my children, about whether they helped me, about whether I relied on them. And I answered honestly, probably too honestly, that they checked in sometimes, that I handled most things on my own. And I watched her eyebrow lift just slightly, as if independence itself was suspicious at my age. Ha ha ha, imagine reaching an age where being capable becomes evidence against you. My head started to ache. A dull pressure behind my eyes, and I could feel the fog creeping back in, the medication still working through my system, making everything slower, heavier, and I worried not about my answers, but about how they would be written down. How a tired voice could be translated into confusion, how pain could be recorded as hesitation, how weakness in a hospital bed could be mistaken for weakness everywhere else. She finished her questions and stood there for a moment, tapping her pen against the clipboard, and that tapping sound felt louder than the machines around me, like a countdown. She said her notes would go to the court, that the judge would review them in the morning, and that I would have a chance to speak if I was well enough. If I was well enough, those words echoed long after she left, the door closing softly behind her, leaving the room strangely quiet. I lay there staring at the ceiling again. My heart racing now, fear finally stepping fully into the room because I understood something terrifying. The story about me was already being written, and I hadn't held the pen once. Shame washed over me in a slow, heavy wave. Shame for being seen like that, measured, evaluated, reduced. Even though I knew I'd done nothing wrong, even though I knew the timing was cruel and unfair, shame doesn't care about logic. It just settles in your chest and stays. A nurse came in later to check on me, her touch gentle, her voice kind, and she muttered quietly that these evaluations shouldn't happen so soon after anesthesia, that it wasn't right, and those few words almost undid me. All because they confirmed what I already knew but needed someone else to say, that this wasn't about my ability, it was about convenience. It was about catching me at my weakest and calling it truth after she left. I lay there listening to the steady beat beside me, every sound reminding me that time was moving forward whether I was ready or not. Tomorrow the judge would read those notes. Tomorrow strangers would decide what kind of person I was based on answers given while my body was still healing. And in the quiet of that room, as exhaustion pulled at me again, I made myself a promise, a quiet one. Whispered into the space no one else could hear, I would be there, I would speak. I would not let the worst moment of my recovery become the defining moment of my life, because even though they had judged me while I was barely awake, even though they had written things down I couldn't take back, I was still here, still thinking, still aware, and tomorrow, no matter how much it hurt, I would make sure they knew it, because if I didn't, those notes would speak for me forever. And that thought was far more frightening than any surgery I had just survived. When my family finally walked into the room the next morning, the air shifted in a way I felt before I saw them. Sigh, that subtle tightening in your chest when something familiar no longer feels safe. My daughter entered first with that careful smile she uses when she wants to appear calm, loving, reasonable, her hair neatly done, her voice soft like she was speaking to a child. Not her own mother who had survived surgery less than a day ago. My son followed behind her, holding a cup of coffee he never offered me, standing just far enough away to avoid touching anything that might make him uncomfortable. And for a moment I almost laughed, ha ha ha, because they looked exactly the way people do when they've rehearsed concern in front of a mirror. They asked how I was feeling, how the surgery went, if I was resting. All the right questions in the right order, but none of them asked how I felt waking up alone. None of them asked what I'd been told, and that silence told me more than their words ever could. I answered politely. Because politeness is a habit that doesn't break easily, even when it's being used against you. My daughter leaned closer and said they'd been worried, that everything happened so fast that they just wanted to make sure I was protected. And there it was again, that word, protected, used like a blanket to cover something sharp. I watched their faces carefully as they spoke, the way their eyes flicked toward each other when certain words came up. The way my son cleared his throat whenever the conversation drifted too close to paperwork or decisions. It felt like listening to a story where I already knew the ending, but still hoped somehow it would change. I asked gently why they didn't wait until I woke up to talk to me, and the pause that followed was so long it almost made me smile, because pauses never lie. My daughter said they didn't want to burden me, that I needed rest, that everything would be explained later, as if my life could be put on hold until it was convenient for them. My son added that it was all temporary, that these things happen all the time, that I shouldn't take it personally. And I remember thinking how strange it is that people say don't take it personally when what they've done is deeply, painfully personal. I asked them if they'd told the court I was confused, and my daughter sighed, a soft practice sigh, and said they'd just shared their concerns, nothing more. But concern doesn't usually come wrapped in legal language. Concern doesn't involve judges and evaluations and control over someone else's property. And as they spoke, small details slipped out without them realizing. Comments about how hard it had been managing things lately, about how complicated my finances were becoming, about how stressful it was for them not knowing what might happen. And with each sentence, the picture grew clearer. This wasn't about my safety. It was about their anxiety, their inconvenience, their desire to simplify their lives by making me smaller. Ha ha ha, imagine shrinking someone's entire existence and calling it help. My chest tightened, not from anger yet, but from the realization that they truly believed their version of events, that in their minds they were the heroes of this story. Stepping in just in time to save an aging woman from herself, I asked if they'd changed anything while I was unconscious, and my son answered too quickly, said no, of course not. Then corrected himself and said just a few small things to make sure everything was secure, another word people use when they've crossed a line. I pressed a little, asking what kind of things, and my daughter mentioned checking paperwork, organizing documents, making sure nothing important was misplaced, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach, because those weren't acts of care, those were acts of preparation. I realized then that they hadn't just reacted to a situation, They had anticipated an outcome, and that outcome did not include me being fully in control anymore. A nurse came in to adjust my IV. And the conversation paused, my children stepping back, their expressions rearranging themselves into something more neutral, something more acceptable for witnesses. And as the nurse worked quietly, I watched my children watch her, waiting, calculating, and that was the moment it hit me. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a heartfelt talk. This was a plan already in motion, one that relied on my silence, my weakness, my recovery keeping me distracted while decisions solidified around me. When the nurse left, my daughter leaned in again and said everything would be okay, that I should just focus on healing, and something inside me finally hardened. Not into rage, but into resolve, because healing doesn't happen when you're being erased, and rest doesn't come when you know your life is being rearranged without your consent. I looked at both of them and said quietly that I wanted to attend the hearing, and the way their faces changed in that instant was almost startling. My son frowned, said it wasn't necessary, that it might be too much for me, that they could handle it, as if my autonomy were a chore to be managed. I repeated myself, firmer this time, and my daughter's smile tightened. She said we'd see how I felt. And that's when I understood how close I was to losing something I might never get back, because every sentence they spoke assumed control, assumed authority, assumed my agreement without ever asking for it. And as they stood there talking about my life like a project already assigned, I realized that if I didn't interrupt this story now, I might never get the chance again. If this is hitting close to home for you, I remember thinking. If you've ever felt spoken over, decided for, quietly pushed aside because someone else thought they knew better, then stay with this story, because what comes next is the part where silence becomes a choice and choices have consequences. My children eventually left, promising to return later, their footsteps fading down the hall, and as the door closed behind them, the room felt both emptier and clearer. I lay back against the pillow, my heart pounding not from fear, but from the sudden understanding that love doesn't always protect you from harm. Sometimes it's the excuse used to justify it. And as I stared at the ceiling once more, a thought settled into place with quiet certainty. Whatever happened next, I would not be handled, managed, or spoken for again, because if I allowed that, the hearing wouldn't just decide my legal status, it would decide who I was allowed to be from that moment on. And I wasn't ready to disappear quietly, not now, not ever. I didn't realize how much damage could be done in silence until the nurse leaned in later that afternoon and mentioned something so casually, it almost slipped past me. She said they'd had a few questions about my room setup at home, about who had access, about whether I lived alone, and something in her tone told me this wasn't small talk. My heart sank as I asked what kind of questions. And she hesitated before admitting my family had already been making arrangements, as if my life were furniture being moved around while I lay stitched and sedated. I asked what arrangements meant. And she said things about keys, about entry, about making sure everything was safe. And that word again hit me like a dull ache. Safe used to soften the sound of control. Ha ha ha. I remember closing my eyes for a second. Not because I was tired, but because I needed to picture my house, my quiet rooms, my desk, my drawers, the small places where I kept things I never thought I'd have to protect. And suddenly those places didn't feel private anymore. They felt exposed, like someone had walked through them with a checklist instead of respect. When the nurse left, I lay there staring at the wall, replaying every conversation from earlier that day, every vague answer, every gentle lie. And it became painfully clear that my family hadn't waited for permission because they didn't think they needed it. They had already decided the outcome. I asked for my phone, my hands shaking slightly as I scrolled through missed calls and messages that now read differently. Messages that sounded concerned on the surface but were really about timing, about making sure things were done before I woke up fully. I tried calling home just to hear something familiar, and it rang and rang before going to voicemail. And in that silence, I felt a wave of violation wash over me, not physical, but something deeper. Something that made my chest tighten, because this wasn't just paperwork anymore. This was my space, my independence, my right to exist without supervision being quietly dismantled. I asked another nurse, softer this time, if my family had been back since morning, and she nodded, said they'd stopped by earlier, had asked questions about discharge planning, about timelines, about access to medical records. All questions that made sense only if you assumed I wouldn't be the one making decisions. Ha ha ha, I almost laughed again at how thorough they were, how efficient, like they'd rehearsed this, and that was when anger finally arrived, not explosive. Not loud but steady and cold, the kind that clears your vision instead of blurring it. I realized then that waiting quietly, hoping this would resolve itself, was exactly what they were counting on. They were counting on my pain, my exhaustion, My good nature, my instinct to avoid conflict, and that realization hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself, because it meant they knew me well enough to try this, but not well enough to know I wouldn't let it stand. I took a slow breath, careful of my stitches, and asked for a pen and paper. The nurse looked surprised but brought them anyway, and as I held the pen, feeling its weight in my fingers, something inside me steadied. Writing my thoughts down wasn't about notes or plans yet, it was about grounding myself, reminding myself that I was still here, still thinking, still capable. I wrote names, dates, small details, anything that anchored me to reality. And as I did, I understood something important. If I didn't show up for myself now, no one else would. And if this story feels uncomfortably familiar to you, if you've ever felt decisions being made around you instead of with you, take a moment and stay here because this part matters more than you think. When my family returned later that evening, their energy was different, quieter, more confident, like people who believe things are already settled. My daughter mentioned they'd checked on the house, just briefly, just to make sure everything was in order, and my heart dropped as I asked what that meant exactly. She avoided my eyes and said they'd changed the locks temporarily. As if that word could undo the violation of it, I felt a sharp pain then, not from surgery, but from the realization that my own front door had been closed to me while I lay helpless. My son said it was standard, that it was for my protection, and I remember thinking how easy it is to justify anything when the person affected isn't standing in front of you. I told them quietly that they had no right, and my son's face tightened. He said we didn't want to risk anything happening, and that was the moment I saw it clearly. They weren't afraid for me. They were afraid of losing control, because control once tasted is hard to give up. The conversation ended quickly after that, not resolved, just paused, and as they left again, I felt something settle into place inside me, a decision clear and unavoidable. I would attend the hearing no matter what it took, pain, weakness. Embarrassment, all of it was secondary now, because what they had changed while I was unconscious couldn't be undone by kindness or patience. It could only be undone by presence, by standing there and saying I am still here. And as I lay back against the pillow that night, listening to the hospital settle into its quiet hum, I understood that the hardest part wasn't the surgery or even the betrayal. It was realizing that my life had been rearranged without my consent, and knowing that tomorrow, unless I stepped back into the center of it myself, it would keep moving without me, and that was something I was no longer willing to allow. By the time they wheeled me toward the courtroom, my body felt like it belonged to someone much older than the person I remembered being. Sight, every small movement sent a reminder through my abdomen that I was still healing, still fragile. And yet the hallway felt colder than the pain, colder than the fear, because this was where my life was being discussed like a file, not a person. The wheels of the chair squeaked softly as we moved. And I remember thinking how strange it was that something so important could begin with such an ordinary sound. When we reached the door, it was already open just enough for me to see inside, and through that narrow gap I saw them. My family seated neatly, confidently, like people who believed they were exactly where they were supposed to be. My daughter sat upright with her hands folded, her face composed into that careful expression she uses when she wants to appear reasonable. My son leaned slightly forward, already engaged, already talking to someone in a low voice, and neither of them looked surprised when they saw me. Not shocked, not relieved, just mildly inconvenienced, as if my presence was a delay they hadn't planned for. Ha ha ha, that small detail told me everything, because if they truly believed I was incapable, they would have been worried to see me there, not annoyed. The judge entered shortly after, a tired-looking man with glasses perched low on his nose, flipping through papers as if this were just another case in a long day. And that terrified me more than anger ever could, because when your life becomes routine to someone else, it's easy for details to be missed. The judge began by summarizing the petition, his voice calm, neutral, listing concerns about my ability to manage my affairs, my safety, my capacity, and each word felt like it landed somewhere just above my heart, heavy but impersonal. My daughter spoke first, her voice soft, steady, filled with phrases like we just want what's best and we've noticed changes. She talked about forgetfulness, about stress, about how hard it was watching me struggle, and I wanted to interrupt, to laugh, to say, when did that happen? But I stayed quiet because something inside me told me this wasn't the moment to react. This was the moment to observe. My son followed, his tone more direct, more confident. He spoke about responsibility, about planning ahead, about how these decisions were necessary, as if stripping someone of their autonomy were as routine as changing a light bulb. And as they spoke, I noticed how easily the words came to them, how smoothly they fit together. All like they'd practiced this conversation, like they'd already convinced themselves this was kindness, not control. The judge nodded occasionally, making small notes, and each scratch of his pen made my stomach tighten. Because I didn't know what he was writing or how my silence was being interpreted, I wondered if he saw a frail woman in a chair and thought the decision was obvious, or if he saw a family acting responsibly, doing what families are supposed to do, and that fear settled deep because truth doesn't always matter as much as presentation, and my family had come prepared when the judge finally looked at me, his gaze softened just slightly. And he asked if I understood why we were there. I nodded and said yes, my voice quieter than I wanted but steady enough to surprise even me. He asked if I felt safe managing my own affairs, and I answered honestly that I did. But before I could say more, my son spoke again, quickly, pointing out my recent surgery, my current condition, suggesting that now might not be the best time for me to assess my own abilities, and that interruption burned. Not because it was loud, but because it was strategic. It framed me as unreliable even as I spoke. The judge raised a hand and allowed him to finish, and I felt that old familiar urge rise in me, the urge to step back, to let others speak, to avoid conflict, but this time I pushed it down. I had spent too many years being polite at my own expense. I waited, my hands gripping the arms of the chair, my heart pounding. The judge returned his attention to the papers, to the notes from the evaluation, the ones written while I was barely awake, and his brow furrowed slightly as he read, but he didn't question them yet, not out loud. And that scared me more than if he had challenged them immediately, because silence from authority can mean agreement or at least acceptance. My daughter leaned forward again, her voice softer now, almost emotional, talking about love, about family, about wanting to ease my burden. And for a moment, just a moment, I wondered if anyone in that room remembered that I could hear them, that I wasn't an object being discussed, but a person sitting right there, listening to my life being summarized by people who had already decided the ending. The judge finally looked up and said he would ask me a few questions directly, and my breath caught, not from fear, but from relief, because finally someone was looking at me instead of around me. He asked me to explain how I managed my daily life, my finances, my home, and I spoke slowly, carefully, describing routines, habits, responsibilities I'd handled for years, and as I spoke, I felt my voice grow steadier, not louder but clearer, like a signal cutting through static. The judge listened, nodding occasionally, but his face remained unreadable. And that uncertainty sat heavy in my chest because I couldn't tell if I was convincing him or merely filling time. My son shifted in his seat, my daughter glanced down briefly, and I sensed the balance in the room beginning to wobble. But not enough yet, not decisively. The judge thanked me and said he would review everything before making a decision, and those words landed like a door closing halfway, not shut but not open either. The hearing ended without resolution, just postponement, and as they wheeled me back out, my family stood, their faces tight with something between frustration and confidence, and I realized something that made my stomach sink. They weren't afraid, not yet, because even if the judge had listened, even if he had heard me, the damage was already in motion. The locks, the access, the narrative written while I was unconscious, all of it existed now. And no single conversation could erase that. As the hallway swallowed us again, the courtroom door closing softly behind me, I felt the weight of what had just happened settle in because I had spoken yes. But speaking wasn't the same as being believed, and belief, I was beginning to understand, often comes too late, and as we moved away from that room, I couldn't shake the thought that whatever the judge decided next, something essential had already shifted, and the real cost of what my family had done might not show itself in court papers, but in the quiet aftermath still waiting for me. The part where you realize winning a hearing doesn't always mean getting your life back, and that realization followed me down the hall, heavy and unresolved, whispering that the hardest question hadn't been asked yet, and when it finally was, the answer might come after everything else had already changed. The judge didn't ask the question right away, and that delay mattered more than anyone in the room understood, because while he shuffled papers and reviewed notes, while the room settled into that tense, polite silence, decisions were still hanging in the air, already shaped by what had been said before I ever opened my mouth. I sat there gripping the arms of the chair, feeling the dull pull in my abdomen with every breath, reminding myself to stay present, to stay steady, because this was the moment everything had been building toward, even if no one else seemed to realize it yet. My daughter sat very still now, her earlier confidence replaced by something tighter, more guarded. My son avoided my eyes entirely, staring instead at the table as if the answers he wanted might be written there. And when the judge finally looked up, really looked up, his gaze landed on me in a way it hadn't before, not as a file, not as a subject of concern, but as a person sitting directly in front of him. And in that moment the room changed, not dramatically, not loudly, but subtly, like a shift in whether you feel before you see it. He cleared his throat and said my name, and hearing it spoken in that space made my chest tighten, because names matter when you're being decided over. He asked me to explain in my own words. how I felt about what had been filed on my behalf, and for a second the words tangled in my throat, not from fear, but from the weight of how much there was to say and how little time I felt I had to say it. I took a breath, slow and careful. And I spoke about waking up confused, about hearing what had been done while I was unconscious, about not being asked, not being consulted, not being given a chance to speak before my life was placed in someone else's hands. My voice wavered once, just once, and I let it because I wasn't there to perform strength, I was there to tell the truth. I explained that surgery makes anyone weak. That pain and medication can make even the sharpest mind seem slow for a few hours, and that judging a person's entire capacity based on that moment was not only unfair, it was dangerous. The judge listened, really listened now. His pen paused midair, and I saw something flicker across his face, recognition maybe, or doubt, and that flicker gave me a small, fragile hope. I continued, describing my routines, my responsibilities. The life I had managed quietly for years without issue. And as I spoke, my daughter shifted in her seat, her hands tightening together. My son cleared his throat, preparing to interrupt, but the judge raised a hand, stopping him without looking away from me, and that small gesture felt like oxygen, all like being allowed to exist fully in the room for the first time. Then the judge asked the question, the one that would echo in my mind long after the hearing ended. He asked why the petition had been filed while I was in surgery, while I was unconscious and unable to respond, and the room froze, truly froze. Because that question hadn't been rehearsed, it wasn't part of the script my family had prepared for. My daughter's mouth opened slightly, then closed. My son shifted again, his confidence cracking just enough to show what lay beneath it. They offered explanations about urgency, about fear, about wanting to protect me from stress. But even as they spoke, the words sounded thin, stretched, like excuses pulled too tightly. The judge didn't interrupt, he let them talk. And the longer they did, the clearer it became that this timing hadn't been an accident. He looked back at me and asked if I had ever been told this was being considered before my surgery, and when I said no, quietly but firmly, something settled in his expression, not anger, not judgment, but gravity, the kind that comes when someone realizes a line may have been crossed. He nodded slowly and said he understood, but then he glanced at the file again, at the notes, at the documents that already existed, and that was when the weight of the title finally made sense to me, because even as the truth surfaced, even as the question was asked, it felt like it had arrived late. Too late to stop certain things from happening, too late to undo locks being changed, too late to erase the assumptions already written down. The judge said he would need time to review everything carefully, that he would consider the timing, the evaluation, my testimony, and he adjourned the hearing without a final decision. And as the room emptied, a strange mixture of relief and loss washed over me, relief that I had finally been heard. Loss because being heard didn't automatically mean being restored. My family stood quickly, avoiding conversation, their faces tight with something like panic now, not because they had lost yet, but because the outcome was no longer guaranteed. And as they walked away, I realized something that made my throat ache. The judge's question had changed the tone, yes, but it hadn't reversed time. It hadn't undone what had already shifted while I was unconscious. It hadn't given me back the sense of safety I'd lost waking up in that hospital bed. And as they wheeled me out again, back into the quiet hallway, I felt the full weight of it settle in. The truth had finally entered the room. But it had arrived after the damage had already begun, and that was the cruel part, the part no court document could fully address, because even if the law corrected itself, even if the papers were reversed, the knowledge remained. The knowledge that while I slept, my life had been judged, reshaped, and nearly taken from me, and that kind of change doesn't simply disappear when a question is asked, no matter how important that question is. And as the doors closed behind me once more, I understood with painful clarity that the next part of this story wouldn't be about what the judge decided. It would be about what I had already lost, and whether it was possible to reclaim more than just legal control after trust itself had been quietly, permanently altered. Walking out of that building felt stranger than walking in, sighed not because anything dramatic had happened, but because nothing had been neatly resolved, the kind of ending that leaves you unsettled instead of relieved. The chair rolled slowly beneath me, every turn of the wheels echoing a thought I couldn't quiet. You were heard, but were you believed enough? The hallway lights blurred slightly as my body reminded me again that I was still healing, still sore, still moving through the world at half speed, and yet my mind felt sharper than it had in years, painfully sharp, because clarity often arrives after damage, not before it. My daughter walked a few steps ahead, not beside me. Not behind me, just far enough to avoid eye contact. My son trailed behind, silent now, his earlier confidence replaced by a stiffness that told me he was calculating what this delay might cost him. Ha, it struck me then how quickly concern disappears when control is threatened. No one asked if I was tired. No one asked if I needed water. The performance had ended, and with it the tenderness. Outside, the air felt cooler, fresher. And for a brief moment, I closed my eyes and breathed it in, grateful for something simple and unchanged. But even that relief carried an ache, because I knew I wasn't going back to the same life I'd had before surgery, not really. Something essential had shifted, something invisible but permanent. The ride back was quiet, no one spoke. And in that silence, I replayed everything, the timing, the words, the way my absence had been used as an opportunity. And I realized that even if the judge ultimately ruled in my favor, even if every document was undone, the knowledge would remain. My family had seen my vulnerability and chosen advantage instead of protection. All that understanding sat heavy in my chest, not as rage, but as grief for the version of motherhood I'd believed in, the version where love meant safety by default. Back at the hospital room, the door closed softly behind us. And my daughter finally spoke, saying this was all a misunderstanding, that things had just gotten out of hand, and I almost laughed. Ha ha ha, because misunderstandings don't involve courts and locks and whispered decisions made while someone is unconscious. Misunderstandings don't require secrecy, they require conversation, and this had been anything but. My son added that they were just trying to plan ahead, that everyone does this eventually. And I looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw not concern but fear of uncertainty, fear of inconvenience. Fear of having to adjust his own life instead of adjusting mine. I told them quietly that planning ahead doesn't mean removing someone from their own life, and my daughter's eyes filled with tears, but tears don't always mean remorse. Sometimes they mean frustration at being stopped. They left soon after, not angry, not apologetic, just unsettled. And when the room was quiet again, I lay back and stared at the ceiling, the same ceiling I'd woken to after surgery. And it felt different now, not unfamiliar anymore, just bare, honest. I thought about everything I'd almost lost, not just control over money or property, but the right to decide when to wake up, where to live, who to trust. Things so basic you don't realize how precious they are until someone tries to take them. The nurse came in later to check on me, her voice gentle, her touch careful, and she told me I'd done well. That not everyone would have had the strength to speak up so soon after surgery, and I smiled faintly, not because I felt strong, but because strength had become my only option, lying there later, alone. The weight of the day finally pressed down on me, and tears came then, slow and quiet, not dramatic, just honest, tears for the loss of innocence, tears for the trust that wouldn't be rebuilt easily. Tears for the realization that love doesn't always grow in the same direction for everyone. I wasn't angry in that moment, just tired of pretending that family automatically means safe. Tired of carrying expectations that no longer fit reality. And in that exhaustion, a new understanding settled in. Winning a hearing, if it happened, wouldn't be the victory I once imagined, because the real loss had already occurred. The loss of certainty, the loss of unquestioned belonging, the loss of knowing that the people closest to you will always act in your best interest. I understood then that whatever came next would require boundaries I'd never needed before. Decisions I'd avoided making because they felt harsh, and as the room dimmed and the hospital quieted for the night, I accepted something that felt both painful and empowering. I could not go back to who I was before this, but I could decide who I would be after it, and that choice, unlike the ones made while I was unconscious, would finally be mine, because even though the judge's decision still loomed ahead, even though the legal outcome remained uncertain, one truth had already become clear: my life would never again run on trust alone, and the final chapter of this story would not be written in a courtroom. It would be written in the choices I made once I stepped back into the world. Fully awake, fully aware, and no longer willing to be quietly rewritten by anyone, not even the people who once knew my heart better than I knew theirs. And as I closed my eyes that night, the thought that followed me into the dark was simple and unsettling. Freedom doesn't always feel like relief at first. Sometimes it feels like loss, and learning the difference is the hardest part still waiting ahead. The days that followed didn't arrive with drama or apologies or sudden understanding. They arrived quietly, one after another, sigh like a slow tide pulling back just enough to show you what had been buried all along. My body healed in small, uneven steps, pain easing here, lingering there, but my mind moved differently now. Sharper, less forgiving, more awake than it had been before any surgery, before any courtroom. Before I learned how easily love can turn into control when fear is allowed to lead, I went home eventually, back to rooms that looked the same but didn't feel the same. Because once you know someone has walked through your life with entitlement instead of care, the air itself feels altered. I noticed small things, drawers that had been opened, papers that weren't where I left them, nothing dramatic, nothing provable, but enough to remind me that my absence had been used, and that knowledge stayed with me, not like anger, but like a steady weight. My family called less after that. Conversations became shorter, careful, almost formal. And I let them be that way because distance, I learned, is sometimes the only way to keep what's left of yourself intact. I thought often about the judge's question, how it had finally cracked the surface of what was happening. And yet, how late it had come, not late enough to change the legal process, perhaps, but late enough that the damage to trust had already been done. And that's the part no ruling can fix, no document can restore. People think justice is about outcomes, about winning or losing, but sometimes justice is simply being seen clearly, even if that clarity arrives after everything else has shifted. I spent long afternoons sitting in quiet rooms, listening to the house breathe, letting myself feel the grief I'd avoided for years. Grief for the mother I'd been who believed sacrifice would always be repaid with respect. Grief for the future I'd imagined where aging meant support instead of surveillance. All those tears came softly, without shame, because pretending not to hurt is what had made me vulnerable in the first place. And I wasn't going to do that anymore. Slowly, almost without noticing. Something else grew alongside the grief, resolve, not loud or defiant, just firm. I began changing things, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Boundaries where there had been none, clarity where there had been assumptions, decisions made with intention instead of habit. And each small choice felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been quietly handed away over the years. My children didn't like these changes, I could tell, but liking them was never the requirement, respect was, and respect had to be taught now, not begged for. There were moments when loneliness crept in. Moments when I wondered if standing my ground had cost me something irreplaceable, and maybe it had, but then I remembered how it felt to wake up and realize my life was being decided without me, and that memory answered every doubt. Because no relationship is worth losing yourself, not even the ones we're told should mean everything. I don't tell this story because I want sympathy, ha, or outrage or sides taken. I tell it because too many people believe this could never happen to them, because they confuse love with safety and familiarity with loyalty. And if there's one truth I carry now, it's this: vulnerability does not cancel your right to dignity. Age does not erase your voice, and being kind does not mean being available for control. If you're listening to this and something in it feels uncomfortably familiar, if you've ever felt spoken over, decided for, quietly pushed aside for your own good, then stay aware, ask questions, protect your voice before you're forced to fight for it. Because waking up is harder than staying alert, and by the time someone finally asks the right question, it may already be too late to undo everything else. I didn't lose my life that day, but I lost an illusion, and losing it hurt, yet it also gave me something I hadn't realized I needed: myself, fully present, fully awake, and unwilling to disappear quietly ever again. And if stories like this matter to you, if you believe dignity should never be taken in silence, consider subscribing for more real, human stories like this one, stories about resilience, boundaries, and finding your voice when it matters most, because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply refuse to be rewritten.